Until the 1840s, tensions between the North and South are relatively contained. If no other sectional controversies develop, the country may be able to work out its differences. But issues related to Western expansion soon spiral beyond control.
The 1850s is, in many ways, a Cold War getting hotter. A series of crises beset the nation, beginning ironically with a compromise that proved quickly bankrupt.
You had the giants of American political life. You had Henry Clay of Kentucky, a Whig, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, John C. Calhoun, the great senator from South Carolina, engage in debate over the future of the nation. Would that future include slavery?
As one historian, Bill Barney, has pointed out, there's a concern in the South that the land open to slavery remains constant, and the slave population continues to grow at the rate of roughly 25% per 10-year period per census. Pretty soon, you're going to have slaves chasing runaway masters. So benevolent diffusion was the phrase used on one or two occasions about opening up more of the land gained from the Mexican War, the American West, to the slave plantation system.
These aging senators, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, whose voices have influenced decades of legislation, dominate the first phase of the debate. In fact, Clay offers a compromise proposal, which
outlawed the slave trade, the buying and selling of African Americans in the District of Columbia, that passed a very stringent Fugitive Slave Act, which addressed the concerns of some Southerners, which organized new territories without the mention of slavery, thus allowing the people who settled those regions to determine the future of slavery in that area. Admitted California as a free state, adopted some of the debt that Texas had been building up ever since the Texas Revolution in 1836. In any event, the Compromise of 1850 was supposedly an omnibus bill. It had something for everyone. Unfortunately, it really didn't solve any problems.
After 6 months of impassioned debate, Clay's proposal is defeated, and a younger group of leaders enters the scene. William Seward of New York, who opposes the compromise. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, representing the new Cotton South, and Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois.
Stephen Douglas, the little giant, 5'2", but he could pack a wallop. A fabulous speaker, like many of the great politicians of that day, was a leader of a political movement called the Young Democrats. He took over the reins of power from Henry Clay in all the negotiation of the Compromise of 1850.
The sudden death of President Zachary Taylor removes one major obstacle to the compromise. That and Douglas's decision to break up the omnibus bill into a series of separate measures that could be considered individually broke the deadlock. By September, the compromise legislation is enacted into law with the support of President Millard Fillmore.
Elements of this compromise were problematical. They satisfied nobody, but they did allow the nation to go on for a while. But crumbling, the first thing to go was the two-party system. Now, both the Whigs and the Democrats were national parties, but over the issue of slavery, they became sectional parties. And this happened first in the Whigs. The Whigs disintegrated. From 1851 to 52 to 53, they just simply ceased to exist as a party because they couldn't bring their northern and southern wings together.
As a result, Democrat Franklin Pierce wins the presidency in 1852, vowing to maintain national harmony by avoiding divisive issues. But as Western territories, once considered unfit for cultivation, begin to open up, questions of slave versus free again take center stage. Even the route of the proposed transcontinental railroad becomes an issue.
Until the mid-19th century, the direction of movement in this continent is from the south to the north. It's from Mexico north, or else it's coming down Hudson's Bay down the Pacific coast. First with the gold rush and the Oregon Trail, which are relatively small migrations compared to what's coming later. They begin to shift a little bit east-west, but with the railroads, the whole continent is reoriented from the west to the east and the east to the west. It allows a whole set of resources which existed in the west to really enter the national economy.
Stephen A. Douglas, senator from Illinois, perhaps because he wanted the eastern terminus of a transcontinental railroad to be Chicago instead of St. Louis or New Orleans, thus needed to get some states organized in territories to his west, proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
And when he did, he created a great controversy because the Southern senators, the Southern political elite, and the Southern planters, Southern Democrats, said, wait a minute, if Kansas is organized as a territory, it's probably going to come in as a free state, and then where are we going to be? And of course, Stephen Douglas needed the Democratic votes in order to pass this bill. And so he said to them, what can I do to get this bill passed? Because he was thinking, organize the territory, get the pioneers out there, and get the railroad through there. And they said, abolish the Missouri Compromise line. Throw it open to popular sovereignty. Well, it was a hard sell in the North, but he was able to do it, just barely, mostly with Southern votes. So you had the Kansas-Nebraska bill pass in 1854.
And consequently, there's a sort of a mini civil war that takes place in Kansas as it attempts to determine whether it's going to be a slave state or free soil.
The first shot, I guess you could say, was fired by Senator David Atchison of Missouri. And he said in his Senate speech, and here I'm paraphrasing, we are going to organize Kansas for slavery. And on the other side, Senator Charles Sumner and many Massachusetts men said, we're going to fund settlers to go in to Kansas and organize as a free state. So the situation was polarized from the get-go.
Territorial elections in the spring of 1855 ignite a storm of protests.
There are border ruffians who ride across from Missouri and vote in Kansas elections. And in the process, they often do a little looting and burning.
You had almost an exclusively pro-slavery territorial legislature that was elected fraudulently. So if you were President Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, what would you do? Clearly, thousands of votes were fraudulent. There was no doubt about that. Well, he decided that he would accept the election of the fraudulent legislature rather than stir up any trouble.
But trouble is already brewing.
The Free Staters decided to hold their own election, and they established their own capital, which was at Lawrence, Kansas. So you had two governments, and you also had a number of men who were organizing themselves into militias, and it was a very, very unstable situation.
You have some of the most brutal guerrilla fighting in American history. What this is largely night riding. It will produce the James Gang, the Younger Gang, Quantrell's Raiders, and will also be jayhawkers in Kansas who will raid back into Missouri.
A man named John Brown goes into the homes of some prominent pro-slavery people, takes them out and summarily executes them, apologizing, but saying that, gee, you're pro-slavery and we can't have that, and this is an absolute.
You can only fight on this level, exercise this kind of cruelty where it's really personal. I mean, these are people who sometimes had been neighbors, who know each other, hate each other, and nowhere to find each other. And it's the kind of thing which will devastate this kind of countryside. Atrocities on both sides. Both sides will raise the black flag. They take no prisoners.
Kansas becomes bleeding Kansas. So much so that the United States Army had to go there in an effort to try to keep the peace. This is a sectional crisis that is, in fact, deteriorating.
And this controversy came back to the halls of Congress, and that is when you had the debates over what to do in Kansas between Charles Sumner attacking the Southern senator from South Carolina and calling slavery a whore, and his attack by a representative from South Carolina, Preston Brooks. So if you just can imagine this kind of thing happening on an ordinary daily basis, it just really did seem like the country was falling apart.
It is against this backdrop that the country approaches the presidential election of 1856. Democratic Party leaders, looking for a candidate who cannot be linked to bleeding Kansas, nominate James Buchanan, a party regular who was in England during the crisis. The newly formed Republican Party nominates John Fremont, who gained fame as the man who mapped the Oregon Trail.
Young, ambitious former Whigs like Abraham Lincoln, like Salmon Chase, like Joshua Giddings, like Charles Sumner, joined the Republican Party because it took the economic program of the Whigs and wedded it to anti-slavery principles when it came to slavery in the territories. And as it turned out, Fremont did very well in a three-way race, which Buchanan won. And the thing about the Republican Party that most students of American history tend to forget is that it was the first party ever in American history to arise out of a purely sectional issue. So it was a Northern party, identified with Northern leaders, appealing to the Northern electorate, with no base at all in the Southern party.
In the year Buchanan takes office, a financial panic strikes the country, followed by a depression that lasts several years. And in March of 1857, only 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, the Supreme Court of the United States hands down one of the most controversial decisions in its history. Its ruling in the case of Dred Scott versus Sanford.
Dred Scott had been a slave. He had belonged to an army physician who had taken Dred Scott in the course of his military service into territory that had been made free soil by the Northwest Ordinance and by the Missouri Compromise. And on the basis of that, when this surgeon died, Dred Scott sued his estate for his freedom. The case took 9 years to get to the Supreme Court. The court said, first of all, that Dred Scott was not a citizen, thus could not sue, and thus they threw out his suit for his freedom. However, the court went on, which it didn't have to do, to say that slaves are property and you can take property any place in the country. Therefore, you can't make any place free soil, was the implication. And this really forced an impasse upon those who would abolish slavery or even limit it in any way.
And it was in these circumstances that in 1858, the contest for the senator from Illinois should occupy our attention, because in that contest you had Abraham Lincoln pitted against his old rival, Stephen Douglas.
Now, the Constitution, of course, during the 19th century prescribed that senators would be chosen by state legislatures. However, candidates for the Senate could reinforce their candidacy by appealing to the people, who, of course, elected the state legislators. So Lincoln and Douglas conducted a series of debates throughout the state of Illinois and really made Lincoln not a household word necessarily, but a known name in a way that nothing else probably could.
They were all-day affairs with Lincoln and Douglas each talking mainly about slavery. I mean, it was just amazing how how important they were and how well attended they were and how eloquent both men were. And if you can imagine the 6'4" Lincoln standing next to the 5'2" Douglas and really laying out the position of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in these marvelous series of debates. So everyone was reading about them. Everyone was wondering what Stephen Douglas was going to say about the Dred Scott decision, how Abraham Lincoln was going to respond when Stephen Douglas charged Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party with being, quote-unquote, nigger-loving and advocating racial amalgamation. So you had so many important issues about the country being discussed in these elections in a very political, circus-like atmosphere that was part and parcel of the electioneering of the 19th century.
Douglas wins the Senate seat in 1858, but beyond Illinois, the Democrats lose ground. The party forfeits its majority in the House, resulting in stormy congressional sessions during the next 2 years. The battles in Congress, however, are soon overshadowed by a spectacular event just south of the Capitol.
John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia. John Brown had been prominent in allowing and making Kansas bleed. He migrated east again, collected a number of his followers. He had visions about striking a blow against slavery. And in October of 1859, swept into Harper's Ferry and attempted to capture this really oversized town. The locals managed to drive John Brown and a few, maybe a half a dozen of his followers into a fire engine house on the Arsenal grounds in Harper's Ferry. And there, they essentially trapped Brown and 13 hostages.
The rumors that reached the War Department in Washington claim that as many as 2,000 runaway slaves have seized control of the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. The Secretary of War summons Colonel Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stuart, who just happened to be in the area.
They briefed Lee, told him he could have a couple of companies of Marines, which were the only soldiers in the neighborhood. They put those Marines on a train, sent the train toward Harper's Ferry. Lee, still in civilian clothes, and Stuart, who had volunteered to be his aide, commandeered another railroad engine and set out behind the Marines.
It is dark when they arrive. Lee surveys the situation and begins formulating a plan. Jeb Stuart, Lee's emissary, will give the fugitives a chance to surrender. If they refuse, the Marine commander Israel Green will take 12 men and charge the firehouse where Brown and his followers are barricaded. At dawn the next morning, Lee watches his plans unfold.
And Jeb Stuart, probably very nervous, waving a white flag, walked up to the door. And the door opened a crack, and Stuart looked into the face of a carbine, a rifle. He recognized, ironically, the man at the other end of that carbine as John Brown, because Stuart had encountered him in Kansas in 1856. Stuart hands him Lee's note. Brown immediately, as Lee had predicted, attempted to bargain, using the hostages. Give me a mile's head start, and I will turn loose the hostages. Stuart, in accord with Lee's instructions, said no to every attempt at bargaining. And finally, when he realized that Brown was not going to surrender, Stuart stepped back from the door and waved his cap, which was a signal to Israel Green and his Marines.
The Marines charged the firehouse.
Green was armed only with a light dress sword. He charged the man who was loading this weapon, tried to stab him, and then, with a certain frenzy, ended up using the hilt of the sword to pummel Brown into unconsciousness. Meanwhile, his fellow Marines had made short work of the raiders. So John Brown was through raiding Harper's Ferry. I think Lee deserves some credit for handling a hostage crisis. He acted with decision and leadership, and not one hair of the 13 hostages was harmed. Brown finally found something he could do well. That is, he could die. He challenged Americans then and now to consider what a just man ought to do when confronted with an unjust institution, that is slavery. He went to his death unflinchingly, and even inspired a man that they would later call Stonewall Jackson to write in his diary, "Brown died well."
No other single event does more than the Harper's Ferry raid to convince white Southerners that they cannot live safely in the Union. It sets the stage for a crucial presidential election, the election of 1860.
The trial of John Brown for treason was yet another incredibly divisive and controversial part of the politics leading up to the 1860 election. Now, for the Republicans, they were sure that if they played their cards right, they could win in 1860. But who to nominate? And that is where Abraham Lincoln comes in, because in 1859 he embarked on a speech-making tour. He was going to visit his son Robert at Harvard, and he was asked to speak at Cooper Union in New York City. And he knew it would have to be the speech of his life. Abraham Lincoln, as he came into Cooper Union, this large auditorium with thousands of very highfalutin, sophisticated Northerners waiting to see what he could say for himself.
When Lincoln rose to speak, I was greatly disappointed. He was tall, oh how tall, and so angular and awkward that I had for an instant a feeling of pity for so ungainly a man.
Those who insist that federal control of slavery in federal territories violates the Constitution point us to the provision which they suppose it thus violates. Your purpose, then, plainly stated, is that you will destroy the government, unless you be allowed to construe and enforce the Constitution as you please.
And he blew people away with his speech.
His face lighted up as with an inward fire. The whole man was transfigured. I forgot his clothes, his personal appearance, and his individual peculiarities.
You will not abide the election of a Republican president? In that supposed event, you say, you will destroy the Union. And then you say, the great crime of having destroyed it will be upon us. That is cool. A highwayman holds a pistol to my ear and mutters through his teeth, "Stand and deliver, or I shall kill you, and then you will be a murderer."
Presently forgetting myself, I was on my feet like the rest, yelling like a wild Indian, cheering this wonderful man.
Let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to view our duty as we understand it.
So he electrified the northern audiences, and he came back to Illinois in a very good position. Meanwhile, the Democrats were falling apart.
The party came apart in a platform fight over a plank guaranteeing the sanctity of slavery, which Northern Democrats were not willing to support. And Southerners, led by William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama, walked out of the convention, thus rendering the convention incapable of nominating a candidate. The convention adjourned and met as Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats dutifully nominated Stephen A. Douglas for president. The Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. Meanwhile, the Republicans, smelling victory as they surely should have, met in Chicago in May of 1860 and nominated Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not the odds-on favorite. William H. Seward of New York was. Seward, who was better known, had made enough enemies within the Republican Party, so that Lincoln, the one-term congressman from Illinois, champion of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, this sort of folkloric Lincoln, the rail splitter, honest Abe. Lincoln was very, very good about having managers who handled his campaign with great talent and skill. Lincoln was in Springfield insisting, "I will make no deals and be bound by none." His managers were in Chicago promising 4 or 5 people they could be Secretary of State. In any event, Lincoln got the votes and on the third ballot forged into the lead and took the nomination.
Campaigning among the major candidates is intense.
The Republicans campaigned on a broad front, promising that they would limit the expansion of slavery. Slavery would have to live where it was and never expand into the territories gained in the Mexican War. Lincoln campaigned for a higher tariff on manufactured goods, for a Homestead Act giving public land in the West free to people who would go and live on it for 5 years. subsidies for railroads to improve transportation, a broad base of economic expansion.
Their platform was incredibly repellent to most Southerners. And the issues were the same issues that had been dominating the national political culture for the whole decade of the 1850s. The issue was over slavery in the territories and what to do about it.
Douglas's Northern Democratic platform heralded popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. Douglas also, hoping to garner some support in the South, suggested that the United States ought to think about capturing Cuba, a potential extension of the slave plantation system into sugar in the Caribbean. John C. Breckinridge, the Southern Democratic candidate, essentially campaigned, he thought Cuba was a nice idea too, but mainly on the sanctity of slave property and the expansion of property wherever property could expand.
So the outcome was predictable in a way, because Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party won the election comfortably in the North, won every New England state, many of the northern states, and had a comfortable majority in the Electoral College. However, the combined votes for the other three candidates outweighed the Republican vote. But because they split, Abraham Lincoln was president in November of 1860.
And within a few weeks, the process of dissolution begins. A process that will quickly lead to a prolonged and bloody war between two groups of Americans, each heir to more than a century of struggling to form a nation, each now convinced that it shares no common ground with the other. The Unfinished Nation is a 52-part American history series. For more information about this program and accompanying materials, call 1-800-576-2988 or visit us online at www.intelecom.org.